We'll start in 2 to 3 minutes. Okay, welcome to week two of Design of Steel Structures taught by Professor Damodar Maiti. I'm Trisha Chakraborty, one of the course teaching assistants. I'm a PhD student at IIC Bangalore, and I'll start with a recap of what we have looked at in the last class. One was like to begin with, we need to know that there are two broad branches of structural engineering: analysis and design. And this is a design course, but analysis is a very important step of design. So you need to obviously know analysis before you can even start design. So the concept of analysis is that it is a forward problem. So we will be given all the structural dimensions like the boundary conditions and the applied loads, and for a beam or a column we know the width and breadth and the length, and we know what material is being used, what are the boundary conditions like roller support, fixed support, hinge support, and we know the entire loading pattern. Loads come in form of like uniform distributed load, point loads, applied moment, and all that. So we know everything about the structural configuration, and we have to find out the response induced in the structure. So response induced comes in terms of forces or stresses like bending moment, shear force, torsional moment, and axial force. And it also comes in the form of deflections, displacement, or strain. So for example, what is the midpoint deflection in a simply supported beam? What is the end deflection in a cantilever beam? And so the deflection will automatically induce a strain in the structure. So first comes the applied loads, then comes the forces of displacement or deflection, and then comes the stresses or strains. And ultimately it's the stress or strain that we are more concerned with, because the limit states are generally defined in terms of yield stress or ultimate stress of the material. So basically, it says that the stresses, the net stress induced in any section of the structure should not exceed the yield strength or the ultimate strength, depending on which limit state we are using. And then there are some partial safety factors applied on this, which we are going to look into later. For example, if the ultimate strength of a steel beam is 410 megapascal, usually we are not going to let the induced stress be as high as 410. Usually we are going to apply a safety factor in the denominator. So suppose I divide it by 1.1, and it comes something around 380. So what that means is I'm going to pretend that the ultimate strength is less than 410. I'm going to pretend the 380 is all the structure, all the material can take maximum. So it's called a safety factor, because if I'm underestimating the actual strength of the structure, I'm making it safer. And similarly, we also applied partial safety factors in the loads, but here we multiply it. Like if actually I expect 10 kilonewton load coming somewhere, I'm going to say I'm going to multiply it by 1.5 and say 15 kilonewton. I'm designing it against 15 kilonewton. So I'm going to overestimate the load, I'm going to underestimate the strength, and all of that is going to increase the safety of the structure. So that is partial safety factors, which like where they're denoted by gamma. Usually, we'll look at that when we start bolt design itself from next. I think next class is bolt design, or this class. No, next class. So from there we'll see how the partial safety factors are actually implemented. This is I said conceptually. So anyway, analysis in analysis we are given all the entire structural configuration, and we have to find out the response induced in the structure. And design is the inverse problem. Here we are given the loads to be withstood by the structure broadly, like the loads are also given in analysis, but in analysis the loads are given in a different way. The exact applied loads are given, and the structural configuration is also given. In design, it's like I'm given a very broad, a broad guidelines of what I need, what my requirements are, like the floor area, the approximate arrangements of the columns, the approximate arrangement of the rooms, which the architectural drawing gives us, and then the loads that needs to be withstood by the structure as a whole, unlike what each beam, each column has will undergo. We are given loads as a whole, like this is the dead load I have to consider, which is the self weight of the structure. Now you will say, what is the self weight? Because I have not built the structure yet, I don't know the beams and columns are there. If I don't know the dimensions of the beams and columns in the first place, then how do I know the self weight of the structure? I don't. So design is an iterative process. We are going to we know that the dead load that I have to consider is the total self weight of the structure. The live load, I know some guidelines are given, like for a residential floor we need to control take 2 kilonewton per meter square. For institutional building we need to take 3 kilonewton per meter square. These we get from the IS codes, IS 875 part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then according to which the geographical location we will have some earthquake load, some wind load. So all these are the broad loads. Then we have to propose a, like in STAD or whatever analysis software we are using, we have to propose some structural configuration, like these are the columns, these are the beams, these are their dimensions, this is the material, this is the amount of reinforcement. So all of them we are going to propose, and this is the structural connectivity. So once we have that, that is suppose iteration 0. So we have some self weight, so we know the dead load of this particular configuration. Then we are going to carry out an analysis first. We have the broad loads. The analysis will give us the exact stresses and strains developed in each part of the structure. And then I have to carry out the checks that the limit states are being satisfied. Limit states as in the induced stresses should not exceed the allowed stress anywhere, and the developed strains or displacement should not also exceed the allowable deflection anywhere. So if everything is fine, then whatever I have proposed, I can let it go ahead. And since it is something I am proposing from my engineering experience maybe, or from whatever knowledge I have, it can be it will be different when like multiple people are separately designing for a same building, it same building, bridge, whatever. They will come up with different designs, and that is fine. But you have to ensure that all these checks are satisfied. When it's not, when even if in a single beam something is some criteria is being violated, some limit state, then you have to accordingly modify the structure, like increase the depth of the beam maybe, or put some extra reinforcement in the beam, and then carry out the entire analysis again. Now you can see that maybe that beam is fine now, but due to that increase of depth of that beam, some other column is failing, or some torsion is coming in the building. Torsion is not allowed in building, not even like bending, shear and axial forces we allow in the structure, and we design against them. But torsion of the building as a whole is absolutely not allowed. If it arises, you have to reinforce the structure in such a way that the torsion is killed. So then it's like basically it's an iterative process. You have to increase, and then you have to see that it is all the checks are being satisfied, only then you can let the design go ahead. So we are given the loads to be withstood by the structure, and we are given some criteria on maximum deflection and so on. And we have to find the optimum size of structural elements, not just size, the material also, the connectivity also. So as civil engineers, as structural design engineers, we will get an architectural drawing, and we will propose everything about the structure, and we will give an output also in the form of a drawing, a structural drawing, where all the dimensions are mentioned, all the materials and reinforcement and connectivity is mentioned, so that that drawing is given to the site to be executed. Okay. So now we go come into the materials. So this is like there are two design courses taught in a UG program. Analysis, and for first is structural analysis. Usually we do that in second year we study solid mechanics and structural analysis, and in third year we study design of RC structures, reinforced concrete structures, and then design of steel structures. This is the last one, the last major structural course that comes in by default in any UG civil engineering course. And so far, so I'm assuming that you all have already learned design of RC structures. So concrete is the most versatile material for construction. Like you look around you, the building itself you are sitting in, they are all mostly made of concrete. All the water tanks and all that you see around you. So why do we use steel? And why are we concerned about steel design? Now steel is much stronger than conventional concrete. Steel as a material is it's a metal. Concrete is a like a mixture, is an alloy kind of thing which is made of cement, water, and coarse and fine aggregates. Fine aggregates generally comes in the form of sand, and coarse aggregates in the form of those stone chips. So it's a mixture of those four materials, and it is generally mixed at the site. And steel is a metal. It is a metal which is properly manufactured in the factory, and steel's properties are stronger than concrete. Properties in the sense, strength properties are its tensile stress, and its tensile strength and compressive strength. So it is the maximum tensile stress it can take, and the maximum compressive stress it can take. That is higher for steel for both of those parameters for steel is higher than concrete, but concrete has a decent compressive capacity, but it doesn't have tensile capacity. So concrete has no tensile capacity virtually. So even when we are doing a concrete structure, we do give steel reinforcements to take the tension. But if we are going for an exclusively steel structure, that is fine. Steel can take the compression and tension both. That is fine. Steel also has a high strength to weight ratio because steel is in general a a lightweight material, and the amount of steel at the cross section of the beams and columns that we need in steel structures are also lesser, like almost an order of magnitude lesser than what we need for concrete. So the amount of material needed is less, and it has a high strength to weight ratio, and it is also ductile compared to concrete. This is a very important point. The ductility is physically, it is a property that allows a structure to, like, the amount of deformation a structure, a material, it is a material property. All these things three are material property, not structural property. Structural properties. So material is ductile when it allows a large amount of deformation before it fails, like after it yields and before it actually breaks. If it allows a large amount of deformation, it is ductile. Otherwise it's a brittle material, like it reaches the yield strength and yield stress, and it quickly reaches its ultimate stress and breaks. That is a brittle structure. Otherwise it's a ductile structure. And it is very important because we need, like, if a material has yielded, like whatever material I've used in a building or a bridge or any structure, if it yields and then it deforms a lot, then it gives us a lot of warning. So we can take some measure, like if we see that there's been a significant deflection in some structural element, we can call a structural engineer for some structural health monitoring, and we can replace that. And if we replace that one component, maybe we are saving a lot of money for the future. Instead of, like, if it had immediately collapsed, it could have caused a lot of damage to multiple elements, and the entire structure might have to be reconstructed, or an entire part of the structure might have to be reconstructed. And even more severely, especially in case of extreme loads like extreme wind, extreme earthquake load. If a structure collapses very suddenly, if it is a brittle collapse, which there is no warning time and it just collapses, then it can even lead to loss of life. And while if it if it has a sort of deformation time, we can have time to evacuate the building, and also it has a very severe, it can have quite severe consequences. Like brittle, we never want a structure to be brittle. We always want it to be ductile. And even in RC structures, like when there is steel reinforcement and there is concrete outside, we do design it in such a way that the steel yields first. Why do we do that? Because we want that at least the whatever ductility the steel has, we need that. We want to exploit that. So steel as a structure, as a material, is more ductile compared to concrete. However, steel is costlier than concrete, obviously, because it is brought directly from the factory. It is shipped directly from the factory. The shipping charges and the manufacturing charges, everything is much higher. So we only use steel in specific structures when we actually need it. Like in general, most buildings and like most simple buildings around us and simple structures around us, we make do with concrete because it is cheaper. Because we can make a structure infinitely safe by using very high grade materials, by using high grade lab made alloys, and by making the structural dimensions very large and everything, we could make it in, like, we can increase the strength and safety. But it is also going to become economically unviable. Then there is no point in constructing a structure which is so expensive that it won't be able to recover the construction money in its lifetime. So we have to strike a balance between the money we are investing and the safety, or the utility that we are getting in return. Yes. Okay, and why do we need design? As I've said, the components individually and the entire structure should withstand the load throughout its lifespan, satisfying serviceability criteria. So, So here, the withstanding the load means the ultimate or collapse limit states that the developed stress should not exceed the yield or the ultimate stress in any of the materials, in any of the parts of a structure. And the subversibility criteria are the ones related to low deflections or displacements, that the deflection in any part of the structure should not exceed whatever the limits have been given, and all these limits are taken from IS codes. All the design equations and everything are taken from the Indian standard codes. And throughout its lifespan is also important, because a structure undergoes, like a material undergoes some degradation over its lifetime, not just over its lifetime, with every year that passes, if there is some fatigue damage, some creep, some sort of time dependent, like loading, unloading, loading, unloading, all that weakens the material. It's not that the material that we started with, that amount of strength and resilience is not preserved in that material forever. So it will have some degradation. According to that, we have a structural lifespan, and it's generally 50 years for residential buildings, 75 years for institutional buildings. And it is assumed that once the lifespan is reached, you do not have to demolish the structure and make it again entirely, but you at least should like do a proper structural health monitoring uh, by a structural engineer. And if it requires major damage, major repair, you should let that happen. That doesn't happen mostly, like people, till the structure actually shows some very very severe problems, people usually do not take these safety measures, but we should ideally, because every building or every construction comes with a lifespan associated with it. So the components individually, as in the each floor, each beam, each column, each foundation component, every component individually, and the entire structure, like there are some failure modes which are specific to the component. Like if a beam fails in a shear, like suppose a beam column junction fails in shear, that is a component sort of failure. Suppose a beam midpoint, it deflects too much, that is an individual component serviceability failure. And then there are some entire structural failures, like the structure, like it suppose it, like the foundation, like the soil is, suppose we have done a mistake in the soil report or something, and the entire structure goes down, like the it compresses upon the soil and it goes down. There's differential displacement, or there is torsion in the entire structure. Those are all structure, like those kind of failure modes come in the entire structure. And so the components individually and the structure as the whole should withstand the load throughout its lifespan, satisfying serviceability criteria. So all of these terms and phrases are important. And to properly design a structure, we have to ensure it is economical to construct without compromising safety. So some compromise has to be struck. Like whenever there is a, like we have to strike a balance between two things. Like the more economical it is, the lesser the safety will be, and the more we try to increase the safety, the cost will also drop. So it's less economical. So some compromise has to be there in both sides. So we have to strike upon the best cost effective design, and to do that, the engineer needs knowledge of the design procedure in detail. So we need to know what are the options available to us. Only then we'll be able to, like if you know only one way of designing, then you are going to always propose the same sort of design. But if you know what are the like different clauses which we can exploit and all that, then you can take a better call about specific to each structure. So IS codes are very important here. IS 800 here. Okay, are there any doubts so far, since a lot of people have joined now? If there are any doubts, ask me. Then I'll move forward to the rest of it.
No doubts.
Okay. Okay, so IS 800 2007, it was last amended in 2007. That is the uh, code which we are going to refer to all along this course, and you should have a digital copy of this course code at least. It is the Indian Standard Code for Steel Design. It has basically, if you understand that code from end to end, you don't need all the aspects for this course, of course, but it has basically everything about the design procedure. All the clauses that we are going to follow is there in the code, because that is how, see, structure, that there's a fundamental difference between analysis and design. Analysis is like a fixed thing. It's like, this is the amount of force applied on a, whatever you studied in class 11, 12 mechanics. If this is the force applied on a on a body, this is the acceleration that will be there, this is the velocity that it will start moving in. These are all things that has only one answer, in the sense, this is input and a straightforward forward output. So for analysis, we do not have codes. Analysis is basically just basic physics. Whatever is happening there, it's basic physics and mechanics. But design has a lot of, it can, like a design is something that does can never have a fixed answer, because we have some broad requirements, and we have to fulfill those requirements in whatever way we feel is good. So, and then we also have to keep in mind the economic aspect of it. Like, as structural engineers, we are always under pressure from our clients, that make it, no, we cannot give so much material, we cannot give this grade of steel or concrete, make it less, and then the architect will put some pressure. So it's like there are so many aspects to be considered. So the Indian standard codes are for the standardization of that at least you have to follow the basic things that are given, the basic checks which are given in this code. Basically all the limit states, all the ultimate and the serviceability limit states are given in these Indian standard codes. So as engineers, as structural engineers, we have to minimum tick all those limit states. After that, we can play around with that too, like within the framework of that, we can play around to see best we can optimize the structure. So that is why in analysis code, in the analysis course, you wouldn't have encountered the IS codes. But for the design of steel structures and for the design of concrete structures, this IS 800 and IS 456 are very very important. You have to follow it. And in any book, like in any Indian book of these design, whatever equations you see, they are all taken from the standard codes. And it's like, if you go if you take a for like a steel design course of some American institute, then you will see that different equations are being followed, because that is the standards of that country. Like AISC is the American Institute for Steel Construction. The the European codes have some standards called European, I forgot the full form, but EN codes, AISC codes, these are IS codes. So
European norms.
yes. Okay, European
European
norms.
norms.
Norms. Okay, okay, yes. So all of those are like, it varies from country to country. Because another thing that is also important is that like, since the partial safety factors particularly introduce some inherent safety in the structure, the partial safety factors also vary from place to place, because how much safety you can afford. And of course third world countries will have some less inherent safety built into it, because third world countries need give a more have to give some extra priority to the economical viability than first world countries maybe. So these codes are like the broad concepts of these codes will be similar. We need, for example, for a steel beam, we need to design it against shear, against bending. So there will be one limit state corresponding to shear, limit state corresponding to bending for in all the codes, but they won't be exactly identical. Plus another thing is that in India we use we usually work in Newton and meter, like this kind of units. In American codes and Euro codes, you usually see pounds and inches. So you cannot go and follow those. You can follow if you require, but for this course, or for and if you are looking for to clear a course or exams like GATE or IAS, you're going to have to follow some Indian book which will follow the IS code basically. And I would strongly recommend that IS 800, like everyone should have a look at IS 800, at least like glance through what are the chapter, what are the headings of the different sections. So now I'll start with the like mechanical properties of steel, physical properties of structural steel as detailed by clause 2.2.4.1 of IS 800 2007. Irrespective of its grade, may be taken as there are five such properties which can be taken as mostly constant across whatever grade of steel we are using. One is the density, which is 7850 kg per meter cube. And why do we need it? We need it for, first and foremost, we need to calculate the dead load, because dead load is the self weight of the structure. And how do we calculate weight of anything? Weight is density into volume. And when I have a structural configuration, I know the all the dimensions of the element. So I know the width, I know the length, I know the depth. So I know, basically I know the volume of every structural element, and I also need the density to calculate the mass, and then I will multiply it by g to get the weight. So we need the density. But whether we are using concrete, whether we are using steel, we need the density. It is these all these are like when you are using a software like STAT, all these are given as input inside. And if you are also planning to join the industry or something, you should also see the backend programming of STAT, not just put the inputs. You should see the input file of STAT. You will see that all these inputs are given, where you can directly go into that file and modify it. Modulus of elasticity, or Young's modulus, 2 into 10 to the power 5 Newton per millimeter square. Why is this important? This is important because Young's modulus is a stiffness parameter, and it is what connects stress and strain. In very simple terms, within the linear elastic regime, stress is equal to Young's modulus into strain. Right? It is the slope of the stress strain curve. And you will see that whenever you are going into like this, when we are calculating the stress type response in any structure or any material, we generally are just dealing with the loads and all. But when we are dealing with the deflections or displacement, you will see that this comes in the denominator usually. For example, just go back to the basic analysis course. When you are using methods like the moment area method or the conjugate beam method, you will see that there is a Young's modulus in the denominator, because we are working with the deflection. Or the unit load method for finding like the axial strain in truss members. So this property, the stiffness property, is necessary for finding the deflection. And the Poisson's ratio mu is zero point 0.3. That is also important because, like for homogeneous isotropic material, which is what we usually assume, like so we simplify whatever material we are using as homogeneous and isotropic. Homogeneous means that the property remains same across the entire volume of the material, and isotropic means that the properties remain the same along whatever direction we are looking at. So, for homogeneous and isotropic materials, the entire material behavior is characterized by two properties: the Young's modulus and the Poisson's ratio, or the Young's modulus and the modulus of rigidity. So, these three are not independent, these three are connected. Like only two out of these three, or there is another modulus called the bulk modulus also. All of these are like two of them are independent, and the others can be calculated. In fact, I should show the equations. Young's modulus, bulk modulus, and Poisson's ratio. So this is the equation between like three e equal to 3k into 1 minus 2 nu. So nu is the Poisson's ratio, k is the bulk modulus, e is the Young's modulus. So if any two you know the third one. Similarly, Young's modulus, uh, shear modulus is a g. So here this is, see, E equal to 2g into 1 minus into 1 plus nu. So similarly, like here when I showed these three properties, E, nu and g, nu or mu, Poisson's ratio is represented by that Greek letter. So these only two out of these three are independent. You have equations connecting the rest. And the coefficient of thermal expansion alpha, 12 into 20 power minus 6 per degree centigrade. This is again important because if we have to consider the thermal stress that is generated in the material. Thermal stress, or like basically thermal strain, is defined as alpha into delta T. Alpha is this coefficient, and delta T is the temperature difference. Heating, like increase in temperature, causes expansion, and cooling causes contraction. And if there is a substantial difference in temperature, you actually have to consider that strain. So strain is alpha into delta T. Strain, as you know, is a dimensionless quantity. It is delta L by L basically. And alpha, the unit of alpha is per degree centigrade, and you multiply it by delta T, whose unit is degree centigrade. बाबा, हमारे क्लासमेट से हमको एडमिट में तुमको पढ़े फोन करो. Shabbat, ta-ta. So the temperature difference delta T has units degree centigrade. So alpha into delta T is a dimensionless quantity which is equal to the thermal strain. So if we have the thermal strain, you can find out the thermal stress by multiplying by the modulus of elasticity. So that stress we have to incorporate into our design stress. Like if I am in a uh, if I am in a region where I am expecting sufficient temperature fluctuations, I need to incorporate the thermal strain also into my design. Now, what are these five properties are broadly same across grade of steel. And what is grade of steel? Grade of steel is defined by the yield stress or the ultimate stress. It is basically defined by the stress strain curve of the material. So principal mechanical properties of structural steel which vary according to grade and which are the most important in design are yield stress Fy and tensile or ultimate stress Fu. I'll go into the this curve first. I have looked. We have discussed this in last class, but this is very important, so I'll repeat. Uh, this is a stress strain curve. The y-axis is stress, the x-axis is strain, and we perform a tensile test on a specimen, like a cylindrical specimen. We take and we increase the stress in steps, and we note down the strain, or we note down the strain using some measurement device like a strain gauge. And we don't increase the stress exactly, we increase the load, and we divide the load by the cross sectional area to get the stress. So suppose I do this experiment in 20 steps, like 20 times I increase the load step by step, and at each step I pause and measure the strain. So now I have 10 sets of xy points. For every point, every load point, I have a stress and I have a strain, and I plot those. So I plot those, I join that to get a curve like this. This is an ideal curve. When you are doing an experiment, you won't get a continuous curve. You'll join the points approximately to find the broad behavior of the material. Now, what do these points mean? A is the limit of proportionality. It is the point where the linear nature of the stress strain graph ceases. So O to O is origin, O to A is a straight line, and it's the linear elastic region. From A to B, it is elastic, but it is not linear. A to B is non-linear. Like it is not a straight line. Non-linear means it is not a straight line. But it is elastic, so that means that elasticity means is the property of a material, which means that if I take away the entire stress, like if I release the structure of the material of the entire amount of stress I've applied, the strain will become zero again. So if I unload the structure in any of the zone between O to B, then if I remove the stress, accordingly the strain will also come back to whatever the original strain was. So if I remove this amount of stress, this the strain in the structure will also material will also follow this line and come back to the strain here. If I remove the entire stress, it will come back to zero again, so it will come back to its original configuration. So B is the elastic limit, the limiting point for the condition that material behaves elastically. But Hooke's law does not apply. Hooke's law means the linear part. Hooke's law is that stress is proportional to strain. So O to A is elastic and the Hooke's law applies. O to B is elastic, but in AB region, the Hooke's law does not apply. For most practical purposes, however, it is assumed that the limit of proportionality and elastic limits are almost the same. Then beyond elastic limit, there will be some permanent deformation or permanent set when the load is removed. That is what it means. Like beyond, if I go beyond B once, I can never I can never regain the original configuration. Even if I increase the entire load, then even if I let like the material becomes stress free again, there will be some strain that is called the permanent set. So that's what the elastic limit means. Then C and D, they are very close by again. C and D are the upper yield point and lower yield point. Broadly, it is the yield point, points after which strain increases without correspondingly high increase in load or stress. So you will see, basically you won't get such an ideal graph when you are doing an experiment, but you will see there comes a point after which the slope suddenly falls. You will see that up to from A to C, this is like almost, it's a very steep graph, and then suddenly after this CD zone it becomes very flat. So that means that what does a flat graph here means? It means that if I increase the stress a little bit here, the strain has increased so much. Here a little bit of stress increase means this much of increase in strain, but here this much of stress increase means this much of strain has increased. That means that the material is like it's in expanding, or whatever change of deformation is happening, it's happening very rapidly. So a little bit of stress increases and the strain increases so much. That is when we call that a material has yielded. So that's where the yield point term comes from. So when there is a sharp decrease in the slope, we call that is the stress, that is the yield point. And this point is very important. This CD point is very important because the stress corresponding to this point is what is the yield stress of the material. Here we saw that the two most important properties in steel is the yield stress and the ultimate stress. So Fy is the stress corresponding to this yield point, C or D. Generally they are the same point. And then E is the ultimate or maximum tensile stress. It is the point when necking starts. Necking means that the structure like deforms in a very like in a strange way. Like some cross sections become very thin, some cross sections bulge up. So it means that for effectively this is the highest point in the stress strain curve, and effectively this is my failure point, because after this, even if I don't increase stress, the structure is going to deform and break. F is the fracture point technically, but E is my most critical point, because up to E is the maximum stress I can afford in the structure. Did anyone say anything? Okay. So E is the maximum stress I can afford in the structure. After that, I cannot increase stress. The structure cannot take any more stress. It will fail anyway. So the stress corresponding to E, this point here, is the ultimate stress, or the Fu, which we saw here. So the stress corresponding to C or D is Fy, and the stress corresponding to E is Fu. These are the most important points. And F is the fracture point, the point where the material breaks. So this stress strain curve is like every point is important, and this is a very common, like a very common topic of questioning for of gate exams and all, I think. So you should know about that. And okay, now I'll just look briefly at the common rolled steel sections. The Bureau of Indian Standards (BIS) publishes IS Handbook Number 1, or SP6, which tabulates the weight per unit length, geometric dimensions, other dimensions for various types of steel sections. So there are some types of steel sections, some standard types: I section, C section, angle section. Like I's or joists, and then channels or C's, and these angle sections, T sections. There are these are hollow squares, hollow rectangle, hollow circle, and there are bars, flats, plates. All of these are certain standard types, and then under each type, the SP6 has a lot of standard dimension sets. Like uh, for example, ISMC is a Indian Standard Medium Channel, ISMC 200. That is a name of a section. It has all these specific dimensions, all this inclined, and like the shape and everything will be mentioned in. You'll go, suppose you are thinking of using an ISMC somewhere, you will find out ISMC in the SP6, and you'll go along that row, and you will find all the properties you can possibly need about that section. In that row you will have the weight per unit length, you will have all these dimensions, you will have the centroid position. Like, since this structure is symmetric about the x-axis, but it is not symmetric about the y-axis, sorry. Yes, it is not symmetric about the y-axis. So they will have some, this centroid will be lie along this line, but along this line we have to see where the centroid is. We might need that, so that will be there. Then the moment of inertia about both the axes, and a lot of properties like the plastic modulus, all of that will be there. Also go through that. SP6 is also a very important handbook here. Similarly, for I sections, I and channel and angle sections are the ones which are most commonly used, especially in this course. You will see I and angles mostly. Angle can have equal, like angle sections is basically like an L. It can have equal dimension of both these legs, and it can also have unequal dimensions. And you will see all the properties there, and you are going to choose. And then there are also built up sections in the sense, like these are like these standardizations are done because steel is directly manufactured in the industry, and they are shipped to the site. So that this is the cross section. So basically, if this is the beam, like this is a steel beam, the cross section will be fixed. The cross section is an I section, but the length will be as much as you need. So the length you can cut accordingly, but the diamond cross section will follow these standards. But suppose you don't have what exactly you need in the standardizations, you can make built up sections. Like you can take an I section, and you can take two flats, and you put a flat here above this, and you put a flat here below this, and you bolt them or weld them. Because of the flanges, generally these horizontal parts are what take the bending moment, and webs usually take the shear force. So if I'm seeing that my this channel this joist which I have taken is enough for whatever shear I need, but it is failing slightly in bending, so rather than increasing the entire dimension of the like taking the next I section which will have a thicker web as well, I can just add two thin flats here and here, so that the shear force remains same, but the bending moment that the bending moment capacity of my section increases. So we can do that. We are free to do anything. As design engineers, we are free to propose whatever we want, but we generally try to keep it within the standard sections, because they are easy to procure and they will be cheaper. Like built up sections will have some additional cost of its own, right? The bolting and all that stuff, bolting and welding. So okay, so this we have covered up to this. Now we are going to look at some common modes of failure, which is also again a conceptual, a very important conceptual topic. Modes of failure: bending, local buckling, shear buckling, web crushing and buckling, and lateral torsional buckling. And deflection also. Deflection is a serviceability criteria. These are all ultimate limit states, and the deflection will be a serviceability limit state. Okay, so are there any doubts so far? I'll resume then. The first and the most commonly studied and usually the most governing criteria of failure in beams is bending. Bending is, you would have studied in design of RC structures as well. Bending is the gravity loading gives rise to bending of a beam, because gravity loading is a transverse force. It causes longitudinal stresses to be developed in the beam. So basically, as bending, like, it's like, suppose this is the beam, or this is the length of the beam. If there is a load like this, it will bend like this. So when it bends like this, the bottom fibers undergo tension and the top fibers undergo compression. You can do that with any copy or piece of paper and see that you'll understand, you will get a feel that the if it's bending like this, then the bottom fibers are actually elongating and the top fibers are actually compressing. Similarly, if it bends like this in the opposite direction, the top fibers are extending and the bottom fibers are stretching inward. So gravity loading is transverse load and it gives rise to bending, and bending causes longitudinal stresses. Stress in the sense compression and tension to be developed in the beam. As the bending moment increases, these flexural stresses increase further until they each yield stress. At a certain point, either the steel yields in tension and or yields in compression. At this stage of loading, the beam section becomes plastic. It fails by formation of a plastic hinge at the location of maximum bending moment induced by the loading. So the loading, as you know, that if there is a beam and there is some loading pattern, it will have, you can draw a bending moment diagram. You already know how to do that. Bending moment diagram gives us the variation of the bending moment along the length of the beam. So wherever the maximum point is, like the maximum bending moment for simply supported beam, the maximum bending moment is at the center. For like a symmetric simply supported beam, for a cantilever beam, the maximum bending moment is at the support. So there, that is where if the beam fails in bending, it will fail at the point which has the maximum bending in along the length. So there it will yield first, and then it will form a plastic hinge. A plastic hinge undergoes, like, it's a fully plastic section looks like this. So basically, it starts with this there is a tension and there is a compression, and then it increases. Then Fy is reached, and then the yielding spreads to the entire depth of the beam and it becomes fully plastic. So the top has undergoes Fy, the bottom undergoes Fy, and it is a constant, like a constant plastic moment it is taking. So a plastic hinge forms, and then uh, we say that that part has yielded. So that is a mode of failure. Yielding is not equal to failing. Yielding is not equal to it collapsing, but we may say that we are defining failure ourselves. Failure not does not always mean that the structure like breaks and falls down completely. We are defining failure, so we can say that when the first plastic hinge in my beam forms, I am going to call it failure. So my target is that the maximum bending moment point never reaches yielding. So I have to make the structure, like the structure deep enough, or I have to take a material strong enough so that that doesn't happen. That is what our aim as design engineers is. Then there is another failure, but the like the okay, now the bending moment and the shear force. I'll start with these two because bending and shear are what we have already encountered in concrete. So shear in generally in portions near to the supports, very large shear exists. In this case, the beam may fail in shear if the web is not of sufficient thickness. Formation of plastic hinge accompanies this. Like shear generally is at the supports, the shear force is maximum. Wherever it is, the shear force is maximum. If the shear capacity of the beam is exceeded by the developed shear stress, then it will fail. It will fail in shear. Shear is this kind of failure. Bending fails by formation of cracks. Shear usually fails like this, like it shears off. It's an English word also. Now bending and shear modes of failures we have already seen in concrete, but there are some additional modes of failure in structures. Those are the buckling modes. Buckling means you can take a thin sheet of paper, like, let's see, this is a thin sheet of paper. Thin in the sense the cross sectional area is very small. So if it undergoes compression, it undergoes a mode like this. This is a buckling mode. Like, see, if you take a thick section, it undergoes compression, it will not buckle. But if I make this into a very thin bottle, then the more the compression increases, it has a tendency to undergo this kind of thing. Buckling is a instability failure. And so buckling is only an issue in steel structures, because in the very beginning, when we were looking at why steel is a very, like, lightweight, steel structures are lightweight, because one is its density is less. Another reason is that the sections, like the cross sectional area of the steel sections which are commonly used is very less. Like, look at this is like, for example, a joist section, like an I section. The web thickness of ISMB 200 is 5.7 millimeter. Imagine what, it's just very like 5.7 millimeter is very thin. So, on the other hand, a concrete beam or a concrete column, you cannot imagine that kind of dimension. The minimum dimension of a concrete column has to be 300 millimeter. So, buckling is not an issue in concrete structures, but it is an issue in steel structures. So there are a lot of different types of buckling modes. One is local buckling. During the bending process, if the compression flange or a part of the web is subjected to compression, it is too thin to take any appreciable amount of compression, then the plate may fail due to buckling or rippling even before the full plastic moment is reached. So even if the section as a whole has not formed the plastic hinge, there is a local buckling kind of thing or rippling kind of thing. That is also a failure. As I said, failure is something that we as engineers define. It does not always mean that the thing breaks and falls off completely. So local buckling is an issue. It can be an issue. Then there is something called shear buckling. In shear buckling, it is that, as I said before, like in these sections, the flanges or the flanges usually take the bending and the web takes the shear. So during the shearing process, if the web is too thin, then it is prone to get filled by buckling. It's like the entire section as a whole is not buckling, but the web, just one part of the web. Suppose there is a local like a uniform, sorry, instead of a uniform distribution, suppose there is a point load. So at that point there is very high compression on that tiny part of the web, so it buckles. So that also I have to call failure. So during the shearing process, if the web is too thin, then it is prone to get failed by buckling or rippling again. So this is another mode of failure. Then there is a web crushing or buckling, which happens where, because of very high vertical stresses acts on supports, and at location at some points the beam may fail due to crushing. So the base of this web might get crushed. Like, there is a support, so there is some load, like there is a localized stress developing here, so this part gets crushed, even though the entire section as a whole is fine, but this part get crushed. So that is another mode of failure. These are all distinct modes of failure. Then there is another thing called lateral torsional buckling. This is not a localized one. It is like the entire section has undergoes a torsional failure. So lateral torsional buckling, this type of failure occurs when the beam has high flexural stiffness in the vertical plane as compared to the horizontal plane. So basically, flexural stiffness in the horizontal plane is fine, so it can take the regular bending, but the horizontal flexural stress is not there too much, like it's less. So if there is some eccentric loading, it will buckle in a way like this. For example, a loaded cantilever can deflect and twist in a sideways direction. When this beam is prevented from deflection sideways by a floor or slab construction, the beam is torsionally restrained. So there are two types of beam when we look at beam design in one of the future classes. I think week 9 or 10. Beam is one of the later topics because we have to look at connections first, and then we have to look at tension members, compression members. So beams, unlike in concrete design where we start with beams, here beam is one of the later topics. So there is a two categories. Like, if both the ends of the beam are restrained by floors or columns, then it doesn't have the space to torsionally buckle. So then it is a laterally restrained beam that has one type of design criteria, and then if it is laterally unrestrained, then it has another type of design criteria. It is essential to check the stability of beam in the lateral direction also. A nominal amount of torsional restraint is assumed to exist when the web of a beam is connected through pleat angle end angles. These we will look at later. Right now you won't understand, but it's just enough right now to be able to visualize broadly what kind of failures are occurring here. And so far, all of these, what were these? See, bending, buckling, shear, and the crushing buckling, torsional buckling, all of these have to do with the applied load and the developed stresses or the develop, like if there is buckling, it's because the compressive stress exceeds a certain criteria, it's a certain limit. And then if it is laterally torsionally buckling, it means that the some sort of stress criteria is being violated. In all of these failure criteria, some sort of stress limit state is being violated. But the deflection is a separate topic, a separate category, because it's a like a serviceability criteria is being violated. Modes of failure in beam deflection. Deflection, it is quite practical that a beam may not get failed due to excessive deflection, but on the other hand, too much deflection can lead to discomfort of the occupants along with stripping of a flooring finishes, and it might also see excessive deflection. It's unlikely that a beam deflects so much that it fails actually, but excessive deflection is not allowed all the same. Like, it's not that the own stress type criteria are the only criteria we need to look at. We need to look at the deflection or subversibility criteria also, because see, discomfort of occupants means that if you look up and you see that a beam is like hanging like this, if you see that, you will not feel safe. You are going to call someone to see, you are going to call like someone to check that if it is fine, and you will say that get it repaired and all that. So basically, even though the beam has not actually failed, even though you are safe in the room, you won't feel safe. So you are anyway going to undergo the structure anyway has to undergo the repair process. So we put some deflection criteria. This is one type. Another is like, as it says, that stripping of a flooring or finishes, like excessive deformation can cause some localized damage, and then it can also hamper some functions, like in factories, especially in factories, if there is excessive deformation somewhere, it can hamper the movement of the large equipment like cranes, gantry girders. They need some headroom clearance to go. So all of that. So it means that even if the structure does not fail, even if it is standing properly, there are some deflection criteria also on all the structural elements have some deflection criteria which we have to follow. And now that we have looked at the failure modes, we will look at the loads, the direct action, the indirect actions. So, and lastly, we look at the design philosophies, I think, working stress methods and limit state method. Okay. So loads, these are the forces that act on a structure. Loads are in fact action on a structure due to which a structure responds. That is reaction. So the action acting on a structure may be either direct action or indirect action. Direct action means these loads act directly on the structure and includes dead loads, live loads, snow load, wind load, earthquake loads, all of these. The intensity of these direct actions have been described by various codes or standards. In India, we have IS 875, Part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for dead load, live load, wind load, snow loads, and various possible load combinations, and IS 1893 for earthquake loads. I hope you have already looked at some of these codes as part of the RC design course, because the load codes are common for whatever material you're using. It is agnostic of the material. It is what is the overall requirement on the structure. And then there are some indirect actions, like many times loads act on a structure indirectly, like due to temperature change, settlement, deformation. Settlement means that the foundation settles, like if there is some failure in the soil or in the foundation. Temperature, we have looked at already, that alpha, that coefficient of thermal expansion is important in steel, because steel has a quite high, so alpha. So temperature fluctuations do cause expansion and contraction in the steel. These indirect loads also need to be taken into account in the design process, because this kind of deflections and strains also induce some stress in the structure. Reactions due to actions on structure. As per limit state method of design, the structure is required to satisfy the limit state of serviceability as well as the limit state of collapse. A structure A, stru- a structure needs to be assessed for the effects of design loads or actions, including its individual members and connections. So the analysis is either done by using elastic or plastic method of analysis, and these days we don't obviously do it by hand. We do it by using softwares like STAD or some other ETABS and all that. Now, design of steel structures. Errors and uncertainties get involved in precisely assessing the probable loads that will act on the structure and the structural behavior of the materials. The various structural design requirement criteria relate to corresponding limit states, and thus the design of structure to comply with all essential requirements may be called as a limit state of design. As I've kept on like mentioning this term limit state, there are two design criteria: the strength design criteria and the stiffness design criteria. Stiffness here has to do with the deflections, because stress and strain are connected by the stiffness. The strength design criteria are the ones which are related to possible modes of failure of a structure due to overloading and or under strength conditions. Like, so these design criteria are connected to yielding, buckling, fatigue, brittle fracture, corrosion, all this. The major design philosophies under this criteria are working stress method, ultimate load method, and limit state method. Long like in the 1900s, I think 1980s and all, we used to use the working stress method. The IS codes were built on IS working stress method, but the 2007 amendment of the 800 IS 800 moves on to the limit state method. So we will study the philosophy of working stress method, but most of the work that we do here, like most of the actual designs, we are going to follow the limit state method. And the stiffness or serviceability design criteria. These design criteria are related to the serviceability of a structure under working loads and are prominently concerned with ensuring that a structure has sufficient stiffness that may otherwise lead to excessive deformations, including deflections, distortions, sagging, etc. So these must not happen. Like the strength design or the ultimate limit states mean that there should not be any yielding or any collapse, and the serviceable limit states means that there should not be excessive deformation, distortion, sagging, etc. Now the philosophies, the working stress method and the limit state method. The working stress method is a design approach in civil engineering for intricate analysis and design of RC structures. This theory is based on the idea of computing the stresses and strains in the structure as a result of applied loads. The working stress method operates under the assumption that both concrete and steel display linearly elastic behavior, where the stresses directly correlate with their corresponding strains. So Hooke's law is followed. So we are restricted to the OA portion of the stress strain curve. In this manner, the allowable stress values for concrete and steel are ascertained by considering the factor of safety on only the stress. And the factor of safety acts as a safeguard, accommodating the various uncertainty in material properties, construction techniques, and other influential variables. There are some advantages, obviously. The working stress method is very simple to understand and apply, making it accessible to engineers and designers. That's why the original codes were in this method. It has been widely used for many years and it is well known among engineers and construction professionals, particularly the older ones, like the ones in the heads of the companies and all. The method is generally conservative in nature, which means since it only allows us to work in the linear regime, that means I'm working in a very safe zone. I have not even allowed the structure to yield and like deform a little bit more. So it means that it tends to result in safer designs by considering lower allowable stresses, but that introduces a catch. It increases the cost also, because if I'm assuming that my material only has strength up to its yield strength. It means that I am underestimating the material very severely, because even after the yield stress, it has a lot of strength to offer. For example, Fe 410, a grade of steel, it has its yield strength is 250 MPa and its ultimate strength is 410 MPa. So the working stress method will only say that 250. It can take maximum 250, whereas in reality it can go up to 410. So I am not exploiting that nonlinear regime. So I'm going to use more material. I'm going to need like the overall cost of the structure is going to go up, obviously. Okay. It is allows for easy comparison of design with the permissible limits, ensuring that the structure stays within safe limits. By using this method, engineers can achieve economical designs by optimizing the use of materials while adhering to safety standards. Because at that time, the safety standards and all that was according everything was according to working stress method. The working stress method can be easily integrated with IS codes and standards. It is particularly suitable for designing simple and common structural elements like beams, columns, and slabs. The method is often based on empirical data and real world experience, making it reliable in practical applications. The analysis required for this method is less complex than other advanced methods, making it feasible for smaller projects or situations where advanced analysis isn't necessary. And the method's long history of use in engineering practice attests to its reliability and effectiveness. The disadvantages: the method doesn't fully consider the elastic behavior of material, which can lead to potential underestimation of stress concentration and structural deformations. While conservatism is a merit, it is also a demerit, because it is going to result in over design structure. Over design means that it is extra safe, leading to increased material and construction costs. So it means it is economically, it's uneconomical. The method's reliance on allowable stresses can make it sensitive to variations in material properties, potentially leading to inconsistencies in design. It is unsuitable for complex structures and situations involving nonlinear behavior, dynamic loads, and unique loading conditions, because it's a very simple method. Depending solely on allowable stress limits may not provide adequate safety margins for modern construction practices, which often involve diverse and dynamic loads. The method might not adequately address the effects of multiple simultaneous loads, which are common in real world scenarios. It doesn't consider the redistribution of stresses after a structure yields, which can lead to localized failures, and the method might not effectively account for properties of advanced materials that exhibit nonlinear behavior, such as fiber reinforced composites. And the method doesn't consider time dependent effects like creep and shrinkage, which can impact long term structural performance. So overall, it is a very simplified material which doesn't account for a lot of things. So we moved on to the limit state method. The entire structural design community has moved on to the limit state method. So all the codes have been updated. The codes around all around the world have been updated. The limit state method of design considers all the relevant conditions pertaining to limit states of strength and serviceability. The strength limit states are based on load carrying capacity of the structure, which includes buckling, fatigue, fracture. Serviceability limit states are based on performance of the structure under the actual application of service loads and includes deflection, vibration, corrosion. The loads at working conditions are factored by use of partial safety factors for load, resulting in factored loads or design loads. So this is a very important change from working stress method. In working stress method, we only had one safety factor on the capacity, on the stress, ultimate stress, or the yield strength. But here we have a partial safety factor on the load, and we also have a partial safety factor on the capacity. So the normal strength of the material is called its ultimate capacity, and the corresponding design strength is obtained by dividing the ultimate capacity by a partial safety factor, and we multiply the loads by another partial safety factor to get the design load. So ultimately, the limit state that has to be followed corresponding to each mode of failure is that the design action should be less than or equal to the design strength. It is very intuitive that the loads are against us and the strength is working for us. So I want whatever the design action is, whatever stress strain, whatever the action causes, should be less than my strength or capacity. It is very intuitive. It has advantages. The method recognizes that design parameters are variants. It accounts for uncertainty. The method logically deals with the fact that there always exists a possibility of variation in loads and material properties, which is where the uncertainty is accounted for, because all the properties are not going to be exactly what I'm expecting. There will be some fluctuations. This method gives different weightage to different loads and materials. So it also has like safety factors for things which have more uncertainty. Like if you, for example, there's a very nice example in welding. If it is shop welded and if it is site welded, like if you weld at the site, you have less quality control, so there is a higher safety factor there. And whereas if you are welding it in the shop, you have good quality control, so there is a lower safety factor. Those are very, it's very interesting. Like the Indian standard codes, if you read through them, you will see that you can find out logic in all of that. And loads also similarly, the dead load has a lesser safety factor, I think, but the live load, wind loads, those have higher safety factors because those have more uncertainty associated with it. And the disadvantage is there is a likelihood of design errors because of more complex theory, which are not so in the working stress method. Limited method design is still far better than other design philosophies. And IS 800 2007 is a design code for the structures, which is based on limited method of design, but it still has some working stress method approach in the appendix or towards the end, I think. And design load of if limited method is obtained by multiplying the working load by a partial factor of safety, and the resulting load is the factor load or the design load. Different design loads like dead load, live load, wind load, earthquake loads are then combined under the most severe but realistic conditions. All these clauses are given. And the design strength of the material is obtained by dividing the characteristic strength of the material by a suitable partial safety factor. The design strength of each material and their connection must be such that the most severe combination of design loads must not cause failure. It must also be ensured that the structure is stable against overturning, sway. These are instability modes. So basically, for any structural component or structure as a whole, we are going to have a lot of limit states. So all the limit states corresponding to one mode of failure. So I have to see that it is safe against all the modes of failure. So we'll see it for next class. I think we'll look at bolt design. There we'll see that there are 2 or 3 limit states. All of them have to be satisfied simultaneously. Okay, so this brings us to the end of today's class. Are there any questions? If you don't have any questions, you can leave. I'll wait for some time to.
Yeah, ma'am, this limit state started from 2007 only.
In the code, yes. In Indian codes, yes, because the previous revision of IS 800 was in
So,
1984, I think. 800. 1994, yes. I
Not
have.
about the code actually. The design started from
Oh, no, 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 no.
when we have switched
It is
from
a
working stress method to limit state.
No, the philosophy is much much older. Like, see, the philosophies, all these philosophies emerge in the research industry, and once the research on something is done and finalized, it takes a lot of time to be actually implemented in the codes. So the limit state design, if you look at the history of the research history, you will see it has come long back. But in India, in the context of Indian design, up to 2006, before this amendment was done, people followed IS 800 1984. So then the design used to be done in the working stress method. Like, especially look at our professors, like most of our senior professors in our colleges, they are still, I think, more comfortable with the working stress method because that is what they use mostly. But then after 2007, the industry has moved on towards limit state method.
Okay, this 2007 code is for IS 800. That is for
Limit state method.
steel structures. Yeah, RCC, RCC design. We are talking RCC design also. The steel structure also. Yeah.
Your voice is breaking a little bit, but okay, you are saying RC and steel both, right? So RC now you'll see that the RC structure, the like, IS 456, the last amendment is not in 2008. Sorry, in 2007, it is IS 456.
2000. It's
2000,
2000.
right?
IS
Huh. So
456.
2000 also.
2000.
Huh,
Then
IS
amended in 2019.
Yes, but 2000, the 2001 also uses limit state method. So that itself proves that the limit
Yeah.
state method is older than
Yeah.
2007. Yes, yes, you're right.
Only for the steel structures it has come at the time of 2007, right?
Yes, yes. The only the steel design in Indian context has been updated in 2007, but it is a much older method.
Thank you. Can we drop the call?
Yes, yes, sure. I mean,
Can
if you
we
don't
drop
have,
the call?
yes, yes. If you don't have any questions, you can leave. I'll wait for some time to see if
Yeah.
anyone
Okay.
has any
Thank you.
doubts.
Yeah.